Once, back when I was still in school, I was heading home after evening classes. It was already dark outside, and it struck me as odd that my neighbor, Mr. Vitkovich, was calmly sitting on the bench outside his house. Usually at this time, all the old folks in our neighborhood were long settled in for their evening TV shows. I greeted Mr. Vitkovich, but there was silence in response. I greeted him again. He apologized and said he was lost in thought. "John, do you have a moment? I'd like to tell you something," he said to me. I admit I was a bit surprised. We hadn't really talked much before, and overall I thought Mr. Vitkovich was a bit peculiar. But in that moment he looked so sad and lonely that I decided to listen to the old man. I approached him and sat down on the bench beside him. He looked at me and said, "You should know. I've never told this story to anyone before. What you're about to hear is the undeniable truth. I saw it with my own eyes, and until now I've never spoken of it to anyone. It was a long time ago. You probably know I was born in Poland. It was winter, and that year there was a famine, a terrible hunger." Mr. Vitkovich furrowed his brow and continued his tale. "You probably don't know what hunger really is like. I saw people walking on the street collapse face first into the snow, and other passersby didn't even notice. Everyone acted like it was normal. Nobody could help. But watching such scenes from the window of the grim 5-story building where my father and I lived was horrifying. My father was in the police force, so we had food in our house. My father often disappeared for work. Either he went on urgent assignments or stayed up for days watching criminals. I was about 10 years old, and I was very curious about what my father did at work. But one day, after much pleading and begging, my father finally agreed to take me to work with him. I don't remember what the incident was about anymore. It was something about an anonymous tip, about an old man supposedly involved in some illegal activities. My father and his colleagues were supposed to conduct a search of his apartment. The case seemed routine and not threatening, so I persuaded my father to take me along. Mr. Vitkovich paused abruptly, staring off into the distance. I tried to see what he was looking at, but soon realized his gaze was fixed on nothing in particular. Yes, of course he didn't want to take me with him, but I managed to persuade him, the old man suddenly continued. And so exactly at 6 in the morning, he woke me up and told me to get dressed. At that moment, I thought it was one of the happiest days of my life. I was so immensely interested in this responsible and serious work. And so, we got into the car that arrived. My father greeted his colleagues. As we drove to the location, they were vigorously discussing something about the upcoming case. I hardly remember anything from that discussion. Half an hour later, we arrived. My father told me to stand aside and wait for instructions before I could enter. The apartment where this man lived was on the ground floor. I remember standing at the bottom while my father and his partner went up to the landing and knocked on the door. It took them a while to answer. Someone was shouting loudly. Soon, the door swung open. There stood an elderly man in a tattered bathrobe, very thin. They showed him some documents, and a few policemen entered the apartment. After about 5 minutes, my father emerged and said I could go in too. This man, his face struck me as very strange, with a detached look. It was as if he didn't care at all about what was happening around him. He didn't utter a word from the moment it all began. But when he saw me, he came to life. Everyone was so engrossed in searching the apartment that no one noticed him openly scrutinizing me. I have to admit it was unsettling. Just a while before, they had seated him at the kitchen table, chained to the radiator. Someone patted me on the shoulder, saying, "Keep an eye on him, Joseph. Just don't get too close." I stood at the entrance, trying not to look at him, but I could feel his intense gaze. I wanted to leave, but I had to obey my father. I was ordered to stay here, so I stayed. The panic wouldn't subside, and I glanced sideways at the man. A thin stream of drool dripped from his slightly open mouth all the way to the floor, yet he kept his crazed gaze fixed on me. A creak sounded from the adjacent room. Later, I realized it was my father and the other cops opening the door to the basement. Then, after a brief silence, I heard my father asking where I was. As soon as I replied, I was told to leave the kitchen immediately. I looked back at the old man living here and was stunned. His face contorted in unimaginable grimaces, devoid of sanity, filled with wild hatred and anger. His twisted hand reached towards my face but fell short by a few inches. I felt his foul breath, saw his worn, sharpened teeth. A gunshot snapped me out of my stupor. My father had entered the kitchen and shot the old man. Someone covered the body with a cloth, and someone else rushed into the hallway. I still didn't understand what was happening around me, but one thing was clear. My father saved me. In the chaos, I was left to fend for myself again. The sight of blood seeping from under the cloth was unpleasant. I hurried to leave the kitchen. My heart was still pounding like crazy. I stepped into the hallway and walked slowly along it until an open door to the basement caught my eye. Mr. Vitkovich fell silent, his wide-open eyes looking as if he was reliving all that horror from his distant childhood. He continued. I stretched my neck and peered inside, into the darkness of the cellar. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust. There were limbs and various body parts, legs, arms, heads, entrails, and bones, and judging by the size, all of these belonged to children. Children's parts were piled up, but that wasn't all. I saw a little girl lying in the corner. She was still alive, but missing her legs and arms, and her festering, bleeding stumps were crudely stitched. If you still haven't figured it out, let me explain. The man who lived in this apartment was a real-life cannibal. To stave off hunger, he kidnapped children to eat them. He didn't like frozen meat. That's why he ate a little child, leaving her alive. The girl, by the way, died shortly after. But how do you know these details? I asked, stuttering, recovering slightly from the shock caused by the story. Mr. Vitkovich smirked and said, when more people arrived, my father said he would take me home soon, but I managed to steal a notebook lying on the table in this apartment. I wanted to keep it for, well, it doesn't matter. I discreetly grabbed it and tucked it under my clothes, taking it with me. And later, when I finally had a chance to see what it was, I took it. Turns out, it was the cannibal's diary, where he recorded all his methods and techniques for kidnapping children, as well as methods of cooking and preserving meat. This notebook, I still have it. Want me to show you? I looked at Mr. Vitkovich and jumped in surprise. His eyes, shiny like a child's, eagerly wanting to share some terrible secret, were fixed on me. And surprisingly, even to myself, I really wanted to see that notebook. Well then, let's go, I'll show you, he said, not waiting for my answer, and groaning began to rise. Johnny, come home, it's time for dinner, came from the window of my house. It was my mom calling, who was already waiting for me after school. Mr. Vitkovich, sorry, my mom's calling, will you show me tomorrow, will you? I was burning with curiosity, regretting that I couldn't see it now. Of course, John, of course, come by tomorrow, he replied, and sat back down on the bench. I ran home. The next day, I couldn't wait for the long-awaited addition to the story I had heard, and I was just burning with curiosity. I walked quickly home from school, and then, as I approached my building, I slowed down. People were crowded around Mr. Vitkovich's house, and there were several police cars. Johnny, came the familiar voice, and I saw my father. Quickly, come here. What happened? I asked. Mr. Vitkovich passed away this morning, my dad replied, but there was something off in his voice. He was extremely agitated about something. At that moment, our neighbor, Mr. Davis, approached my father. Peter, have you heard what they found there? It's a real nightmare, Mr. Davis began excitedly. They found a lot of human remains and limbs in his house. All the body parts belong to children aged 5 to 12. They say he's a cannibal. They found his diary in the house, where Vitkovich meticulously recorded all his actions. Frank, keep it down, my father said and hugged me. Yes, I understand everything. Mr. Davis threw a frightened glance at me. Peter, they say that Vitkovich had a heart attack in the morning. He managed to call an ambulance. When the doctors arrived, he was already dead, and they smelled something from the basement where the severed limbs and parts of human bodies were found. Can you imagine? This bastard wrote in his diary how he lured children into his house. He told them an interesting story about a cannibal he supposedly saw in his childhood. He offered to come to his house to show supposedly documentary records of what happened. The interested child agreed and ended up in the apartment, after which he locked them in the basement and then devoured them. I didn't bother to listen further, but just looked up at my father again. He was still looking at me the same way.